Thank you very much, Robin, and thank you for giving us that perspective. Who would have thought that on one of those indicators that Zimbabwe would be better than Australia? Incredible. Okay, renowned science writer Julian Cribb is our next speaker. He has been writing about agriculture and food issues for decades. In recent times, he helped found a vital group, the Foundation for the Human Future, a not-for-profit alliance of scientists and concerned global citizens dedicated to understanding and solving the combination of catastrophic threats that are threatening the whole planet. And I must say there was a report that they issued in 2020 that I have been known to quote. It was a marvellous, marvellous report. In the light of the current crisis in Ukraine, Julian's recent book, Food and War, was most prescient, and he'll no doubt say that, well, it was almost predictable. But anyhow, please welcome Julian.
Thank you very much indeed, Sandy. Ladies and gentlemen, a great honour to speak with you today. So I'm here to talk about renewable food. It's a bit like renewable energy, except it's several times larger and more important. And I'm speaking from a global perspective rather than an Australian perspective. Food is the key to the human future, the future of our civilization and our fate on this planet. The world food supply is now balanced on a knife edge, and as our numbers and our demands increase. Tonight, around about 213,000 more people will sit down to dinner than sat down last night. Together, we're chewing through around about 24 billion meals every day, and by the mid-century, that's going to be 30 billion meals. Yet everything that we need to produce those meals is running short. By the middle of the century, they are going to be in critically short supply. Water, as we probably all know, is facing a crisis. Food already uses 2/3 of the available fresh water on the planet, and yet everywhere you look, rivers, lakes, wetlands are drying up, glaciers and groundwater are vanishing, or we're seeing things like the Lismore floods, which is just water uncontrolled across the landscape. Demand for water from the swollen megacities will double by the 2050s, right? Now, where's that water coming from? It's coming from the farmers because the cities can outbid them for it. The mining and energy sector is going to triple its demand for water. So that water is going to be subtracted from farming. Under present management, there is not enough water on Earth to meet all these needs and to grow the food we need. As a result, water supplies to irrigation agriculture, which produces about 44% of our food, are likely to halve at the very time farmers are being encouraged to double their output. So I'm sure all of you know what that implies. The world's currently losing somewhere between 45 and 75 billion tonnes of topsoil every single year. We have not licked this problem. There's a lot of people who claim we have, but we haven't. In some cases, they're on top of wind erosion, but they're not on top of water erosion, as indeed we saw at Lismore and elsewhere. Now, what that means is that up to 10 kilos of soil are lost for every meal that you eat, right? That sandwich you had for lunch, there's a bucket load of soil went down the river. We've already lost about 1/3 of the world's arable topsoils, according to researchers from Sheffield University. By mid-century, this continued attrition, about 1% of the world's arable soils a year, is going to halve the area of land that is suitable to grow the world's food. Not only are our soils being sacrificed at unsustainable rates, but they are also becoming depleted in minerals and nutrients, more contaminated by salt and acidity, by plastics and by toxic chemicals. This is vitiating the entire food supply. The stable era, which gave birth to agriculture, has ended. It is never coming back. 2 degrees of global warming are now pretty much inevitable. Current predictions are they could happen between about 2030 and 2060, certainly this century. And we're on track for around about 4 degrees by the turn of the century. The food sector, as we have it today, is a major contributor to global warming. In other words, food is destroying its very own basis for survival. About 30% of greenhouse gases comes out of the total of food, not just the agricultural part of it, but also the transport and the restaurants and the supermarkets and what have you. At 2 degrees, we already know it's getting tough, but at 2 degrees, agriculture becomes far harder. It will be hit by fiercer and more frequent droughts, heat waves, fires, floods, soil losses, pest outbreaks, and transport disruption. Now, it's not so much that you're getting a big flood or a big drought. It's that these things are happening with increasing frequency. It's the choppiness of the climate that becomes very difficult for the agricultural model that we've got to handle. Because you may have to handle a flood and a drought and a heat wave in the same growing season. It's the intensity that those events are occurring that is going to damage food production worldwide. For this reason, the whole food supply is becoming increasingly fragile. At 3 to 4 degrees, that's towards the end of this century, agriculture in large parts of the world will become impossible. Food supplies in many regions will collapse. There will be tsunamis of refugees, and the forecasts range from the hundreds of millions to the billions. Conflicts will break out, and we're actually already witnessing one of them at the moment. Our need for food is the greatest destroyer of the natural world. We've cleared more than half the world's land area for food production, and we've emptied the oceans of fish. This has led to a collapse in wild animal numbers in the last half century and decline in the very ecosystem that supports farming and life itself. In addition, agriculture unleashes 5 million tonnes of highly specialised poisons every year into the Earth system. These kill the pollinators and the soil microbes and microflora that fertilise most of our crops, and they accelerate global warming. The great Harvard biologist, the late great Harvard biologist, E.O. Wilson, said, "We are tearing down the biosphere. I don't think the world can sustain this." So to sum it all up, this is what you eat every time you eat a meal. Up to 10 kilos of topsoil, 800 litres of fresh water, there's a ute load, 1.3 litres of fossil fuel, 2 grams of fertiliser, 1/3 of a gram of pesticide, 3.5 kilos of greenhouse gas. Now, by the middle of the century, we'll be devouring 11 trillion meals a year, and each of them will use these resources. I think you can see the problem. The brutal truth, and I love agriculture. I've been writing about it and about farmers and associating with it for half a century. I adore this industry. But the brutal truth is, it's not sustainable. It's not going to feed 10 billion people on a hot planet by the middle of this century. It has to change. One reason it has to change is that throughout history, whenever we haven't had enough food, land, and water, we have fought over it. We've been doing that for 20,000 years. Now, there's evidence from the Stone Age that we were fighting over food back then. And it's continued, and there's a whole list of, famous wars and revolutions that began with a famine or were stoked by a famine. If you look at the map of where the wars have been in the last 50 years, one thing is really striking. The wars are in the countries where food, land, and water are insecure. If you look at the countries where food, land, and water are secure, for example, Australasia, North America, Europe, there have been no wars. Sufficient food leads to peace. This is a very important discovery. Food is the most powerful weapon of peace available to humanity. If we were able to feed everybody adequately and nourish them adequately on this planet, we would reduce the number of wars by around about 2/3, because that's how many wars start as a result of a dispute over food, land, and water. And if we're talking now, why is Vladimir Putin in the Ukraine? For the same reason that Adolf Hitler went in there. Germany's primary war aim Hitler declared it actually in 1926, long before he became Chancellor, was basically to take the Soviet grain belt. And the Soviet grain belt consists of the Russian grain belt and particularly those beautiful, rich soils in the Ukraine. They need it for their national security, right? So we're just seeing actually a repeat of history. I'm not saying it's the only reason he's in there, but I'm saying it's a big motivation. Food security is a big motivation behind this neo-imperial push. Our response to this mighty challenge is not more of the same. I'm afraid we don't need a second green revolution because it's only going to perpetuate the errors of the first one. It is to introduce an entirely new world diet and a system of production that reuses all the resources that the present one wastes. I mean, our system of food production today, ladies and gentlemen, is not about farming. It's about mining. It's a mining system. We dig up all this stuff, whether it's topsoil or fertilizer or whatever, and then we throw it away. It's a terribly wasteful system. So we need a diet that doesn't waste and which is climate proof. Now, this diet in my construction has 3 pillars. First of all, regenerative farming, which you've heard lots about at this conference, and it is taking fire around the world. Farmers, every country I go to, I find farmers who are excited by the task of designing a system of agriculture that repairs not only the farming environment, but the environment around it that supplies its water and soil and biology. So regenerative farming is a big part of this. And if you farm regeneratively, you are much more climate resilient than if you don't. Secondly, urban food systems, much neglected by policymakers, but they nevertheless are taking off like crazy at the moment. We'll talk some more about them. And finally, deep ocean aquaculture, which sounds a bit science fiction at this stage, but believe you me, it isn't. And it is a phenomenal potential source of food. You can grow a hell of a lot of plants and animals in a cubic kilometre of ocean, a lot more than you can grow on a square kilometre of land. Now, regen is a goal already, as I said, being pursued by thousands of people worldwide. This is Joel Salatin. Many of you will know him as one of the great exponents of this approach. It increases farm biodiversity, enriches soils, improves water management, enhances ecosystem performance. It locks up more carbon. It uses far fewer chemicals than fertilizers, integrates plants and animals better. It produces fresh food that is healthier and safer for the consumer. Now, Robin mentioned this, but I mean, basically, 2/3 of people in the world today die from a diet-related disease. In Australia, 3/4 of Australians, 3/4 of this audience will die from a diet-related disease. Okay, so it is time that we paid some attention to the quality of our food system because it ain't great. The regen revolution most needs is to take hold globally, and that requires support from you and I, from all consumers, from scientists, and from investors. Tony's shown us a very good way that we can inspire consumers to buy the right food and not the wrong food. But we need all the ideas we can possibly get. By the 2050, the world's megacities will hold nearly 7 billion people. The one thing all of these cities have in common is that they cannot feed themselves. Okay, if the trucks don't come, the city starves within 2 to 3 days. We know that in Australia when the floods came on the Sunshine Coast. They're gravely at risk from any disruption to the world food supply, whether it's due to climate, resource scarcity, conflict, or pandemic disease. Right? These food chains we've built are incredibly fragile. They can be broken very easily. What they most need, what these cities most need, is a renewable, climate-proof food supply. Now, at the moment, cities presently consume 2/3 of the world's nutrients used in agriculture. And then what do they do with it? They chuck it into landfill or they flush it down the sewer. Most of it ends up on the bottom of the Pacific Ocean or some other unfortunate sea, the Baltic, whatever it is. But this is what I mean. It's a system of waste, organized waste. All of those nutrients, all of which are recyclable, are simply thrown away when we no longer have a need for them. If the world's cities were to recycle all their nutrients and water back into new food using advanced indoor production systems, it will ensure they never starve or go hungry. Okay, I mean, I've seen estimates that places like London could feed the whole of the British Isles if it did that. Most cities can potentially supply a half or more of their own food needs locally doing this. Now, there are thousands, if you just go on the internet and have a look around, there are thousands of enterprises doing this in almost every big city on earth, exploring the use of hydroponics, aquaponics, agritecture, sky farms, micro farms, floating farms, desert farms, biocultures of plant and animal cells, food printers, and other technologies to create a renewable, climate-proof food system which uses less than 1/10 of the land and water now required for agriculture. Now, most of these systems that I've just described, they recycle their water anyway, so they actually don't need any water to keep them going. They just use it again and again. The nutrients, you can recapture all your nutrients and you can shove them back in there again after extracting the toxic ones, which is quite technically feasible. So, what I'm talking about is actually just recreating the agriculture that you can read about in Homer, where they used to put the dung on the paddocks. It's a 3,000-year-old system, but it works. Just recycle those nutrients and, the food supply becomes renewable. The world fish catch peaked in 1994 and it's been going south ever since. The wild harvest of the oceans cannot meet the growing food demands of humanity. Now, we're very close to the limit where it actually crashes now. And there are frequent conflicts over this between different countries. The answer, as on land, is to build a mighty new industry, farming water plants, fish, and sea creatures in the deep oceans. Aquaculture is already the fastest growing food industry on Earth, but it is constrained by environmental, physical, and health limits. The potential, deep ocean aquaculture gets around all of those. First of all, it's nothing near as intensive. So you don't need to use as many poisons. You don't need to worry about, where your nutrients are going after the fish poo them out, because they're in the ocean currents, basically. There is recycling naturally into oceanic plankton. The potential for deep ocean aquaculture is vast. If well managed, it can be totally sustainable and climate proof. It can potentially supply 1/3 of the world's food. So each of these systems I've just described could supply easily 1/3 of the human need for food in 2050. But here's one that really excites me. Now, our diet currently consists, you go to the biggest market on Earth and count all the plants, about 300 plants in the global diet, 300. But according to Dr. Bruce French of Tasmania, there are 30,000 edible plants on planet Earth. So we're eating 1% of what's available for our salad, okay? We're ignoring 99% of the bounty of our planet, a treasure trove of nutritious, delicious, and healthy new foods to enrich our diet and our cuisine. All of these are capable of being produced renewably, on farms, in cities, or in the oceans. They offer a world diet far more diverse, nutritious, balanced, tasty, and healthy. The opportunities for new industries, new livelihoods, new enterprises, better health, and fresh growth from such a revolution as I've described are limited only by our imagination. How do we begin to implement the 3 pillars? First, we've got to realize that we are an animal that spends $70 billion, of these imaginary dollars, every year on developing new food, and $1.8 trillion on better weapons. Okay, so humans are therefore a creature that devotes 25 times more economic effort to killing ourselves than we do to feeding ourselves. If we were to invest just 20%, 1/5 of the world military budget, in peace through food, we will not only feed everyone at all times, we will also lead much healthier lives, repair our damaged planet, and suffer far fewer wars. In the end, human survival can only be assured by food, not by war. A renewable food supply, balanced between regenerative agriculture, urban food, and ocean food, will not only help to secure the future of civilization and our species, it will also enable us to set aside up to half of our presently farmed and grazed lands for the restoration of forests, grasslands, wetlands, and their wildlife. This will help immeasurably to end the sixth extinction. In the estimates of E.O. Wilson, probably about 86% of species now endangered can be saved if we are to rewild, an area of the planet equal to, say, North America, which we can do if we withdraw from agriculture and we get into these other things. I here call for the creation of a Stewards of the Earth program, run mainly by farmers or former farmers and Indigenous people who know and love and understand their landscape. It can be funded from the weapons budget as a major world peace initiative. The vision of renewable food for all described here is practical, technically feasible, and totally affordable. Like the renewable energy revolution, it promises greater prosperity, well-being, health, and security for all citizens of Earth. A secure food supply is, if anything, of greater importance even than a renewable energy supply. It will help to limit all 10 of the catastrophic threats now facing humanity. Ladies and gentlemen, renewable food is the cornerstone of our civilization's future and the key to our fate upon this planet. Thank you.
Thank you, Julian. I took him to task earlier on for a speech I heard him deliver a few years ago in Adelaide because I thought he was too optimistic at the end. But I can see why we need to have a little bit of optimism. Do we have any questions?
Back there.
Thank you, and a very inclusive and welcome presentation, Julian. Much appreciated. Of all of the presentations I've seen here this last couple of days, most of the presentations have a neurolinguistic focus on ethnic Anglo perspectives on agriculture and sustainable foods that totally overlook the natural resources that we have here in plants such as what we term manuroo, that you would describe as pigweed, and rip it up and throw it away, yet it's one of the highest amino acid plants on Earth and should be in every diet and every salad that's ever served or every juice that's made at Boost Juice. Why is it that there is such a cognitive impairment by the it's 1/3 ethnic Anglo minority in this country that completely ignores the native resources that are in this land?
Yeah. A very good question. Having learned what little I know about food in a British boarding school, I would tend to blame the British because they do have the worst diet, and their attitudes contaminated Australian attitudes. Now there are 6,000 edible native plants, most of which are regularly eaten by Indigenous people living naturally. So that's 6,000 different things that we can have in our salad, different things that different industries, new opportunities. If you go in your supermarket, you will probably find 4 or 5 native foods. You might have the bush tomato sauce or the lemon pepper or lemon myrtle or whatever it is, but you won't find a lot. There is no pride in the Australian, botanical genome like there is in Australian sporting prowess. And I would like to change. Look, I challenge the chefs and the food market leaders. I think once the world discovers Australian foods, look what the world has done with American foods, with tomatoes and avocados and chili peppers and what have you. Where would Italian cuisine be without American food, basically? Once they discover Australian foods, the amazing diversity, the flavour, the health benefits, we're on a hiding to nothing. It's a tremendous opportunity. So I think we can actually inspire the world with a new cuisine by growing these things ourselves. And I do know a lot of Indigenous communities around Alice Springs and up at Broome and places like that are starting to cultivate these things because the wild harvest just doesn't meet the demand. So it's starting, but it's very gradual. We need to invest. We need to help those people, get their farms and market gardens going. But the opportunity is phenomenal. We get the TV chefs onto this. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to change the world diet in a trice. We have to be ready for the demand when it comes. But, I think these plants are our native plants. They grow naturally in the environment. If we farm them, we will be trying to maintain and preserve the Australian environment. That's a part of it. We won't be trying to fell the place and stick wheat in. We will be trying to grow, as I say, areas of bush tomatoes and other things that are completely natural within the ecosystem that rely on the underground fungi and things like that maintain the life on this continent. So, I see that as a huge opportunity for us. And so I challenge the foodies among you to go out and really promote Australian native foods. Lots of people have been doing it for a long time, but it hasn't quite caught on yet. There's some very good books, and Vic Cherikoff and people like that have been banging on about it for decades, but it hasn't caught fire yet, and I believe it will.
I'm standing on that. Mike. Yeah. Thanks for your talk, Julian. Peter Leppert from Regenerate Earth. Worked in the same organisation as you for 30 plus years. You probably remember me, perhaps. I married Christine, who ran the Discovery Centre. Having just read Richard Flanagan's book about the salmon farming industry in Tasmania, which is it has some parallels to what our friend from Lock the Gate just told us earlier on. Yeah. About completely destroying a natural ecosystem in the name of producing food. And I don't want to put any dampeners on your enthusiasm for the future, because I share that enthusiasm, because a lot of the solutions are there, as Tim Flannery has written in many of his books too. But there's a rider on this which says, if we continue to rely on big industry to produce our food, like the salmon farming industry in Tassie that Richard wrote about, which have completely captured the politicians and destroyed the livelihoods and the peace and serenity of the people who live around the coast of Tassie where these salmon farms are, and made them all just say, we've got to go, like going off your farms because of coal seam gas, et cetera, et cetera. We have an absolute imperative as citizens to every one of us be involved in the political process and demand of our legislators not to be bought by big industry, which is why we're in the mess we are now. So any comments on that one?
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. The food industry today is not about food. It's about money. It's, all the supermarkets of the world and these big food processing firms and things like that are all motivated by profit. They're not there to give you a healthy diet. That's why they're killing so many people. There is a fundamental truth in that. With regard to the fish farming industry, you're absolutely right. Where fish farming is done in coastal bays and inlets and fjords in Norway and Scotland and places like that, you get a horrible pollution problem because, first of all, there is no water through flow to take away the concentration of the nutrients. Secondly, the fish are all packed, cheek by jowl into these tiny nets, and they develop a lot of sea lice and other parasites, and those require them to be treated just like battery chooks and pigs. They require very high levels of antibiotics and antivirals and all sorts of things to sustain them. So you're getting a thoroughly chemicalized product when you eat it in the supermarket. So it's not a healthy way to farm. I would hope that it's going to be an initial a step towards deep ocean aquaculture, where your fish are much more spread out. As I say, that they're in cages that are potentially kilometres in dimension, square cubic kilometres, and where you don't have those high numbers, you don't have to use the same chemicalized techniques to maintain health. And so on. You can recycle waste nutrients as feed, but particularly you can grow algae, which is the fish's natural food, as a source, a natural feedstock, in fact, to feed all livestock industries, not just fish. But the farming of algae is one of the biggest and most exciting developments. So farming algae actually in the deep oceans is a complementary part of that. Now, how you do that without getting a lot of capital together, well, I don't know, except to say, co-ops is a bloody good idea. The Dutch have never given up on co-ops, unlike Australians. You don't have to have a capitalist structure for ownership. There are other ownership models, including state ownership, including cooperative ownership or collaborative patterns and things like that. So let's just introduce
crowdfunding.
Sorry,
crowdfunding by consumers.
Crowdfunding as well, absolutely. So there are plenty of ways to run that. That what we have to do is get away from those people who see agriculture just as a gold mine. They're just digging gold out of it, and they're punishing the farmers and the fishers and the consumers. Both of them get punished. So this industry is just as sick as the fossil fuels industry, and it needs to be healed.
We have one more question, Jenny. Yep, one more. Okay.
It's Graham here. Julian, all too short around here. Jevons paradox, that's something that's been creeping into my thinking as I've been watching and I've been listening a lot today. And it came out most when I was listening to you. And for those people who know what Jevons paradox is, as I understand it really means the more we fix things, the more we facilitate growth. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts might be in regard to what you were just saying.
How many women are there in the audience? Yeah, about half the audience, right? Well, women have already showed us the way, because in the last 30 or 40 years, they've reduced human birth rates, or the human fertility rate, from 4.4 to 2.4 babies. So they're taking us, female leadership is going to fix this problem, right? They will take us to where we need to go, which is a human population of about 2 billion by 2120. Okay, we have to get the population down. The population tends to drive economic growth. The two are utterly interwoven, and you can't fix one without fixing the other. Now, I'm not suggesting anything compulsory about this. I believe it can be done simply by providing people with contraceptive technologies, good advice, family planning, all of those kinds of things, as Sustainable Population Australia has been banging on about for the last few decades. It can be done. We know we can get the human population down quite quickly. There are countries which are just on the brinks of an absolute population collapse, like Japan and so on. But at the moment there is something holding us back, and Jane O'Sullivan has talked about it. We've had our mouths zipped. We're not allowed to talk about don't mention the population. We've got to talk about population, folk. There's too many of us. The women of the world, whether they're in Africa or Australia or Europe, instinctually know this, and they are curbing their fertility. They feel that the number of people we're producing at the moment is not good for our long-term survival. It's as natural a response as the baby boom was after World War II. So, we've got to get on side with that. We've got to put down all the old men in frayed bloody jumpers and the politicians and the priests and other people who are telling us to have big families, because that is a recipe for disaster. That is a recipe for famine, for war, for the destruction of our grandchildren. People who advocate population growth are advocating all of those evils. And we have to make that very, very clear. So, let's move the conversation on.